Hey guys, it's Courtney and I'm here with a 5-card 1-kit video for the latest Flavor of the Month card kit by Scrapping for Less. It comes with 4 different collections and the Banana Split collection if you choose, some cardstock as well as a die that is unfortunately not in my hand thanks to the pandemic. Things are a little delayed. It will be available for customers. We just didn't get it in time for the design team. So let's jump right into card number 1. I'm going to be using collection number 1. And first we'll take a quick look at what comes in this collection. You can see that it comes with a stamp set. And we have this little Bigfoot here. We have some flower embellishments, some chalkboard hearts, and of course the envelope and some double-sided 6x6 pattern papers. So for this one, I'm going to start off by stamping out my image onto a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm using my Mini Misty here just because I've never stamped the image before, and sometimes you have to stamp it twice when it's brand new. But I'm stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. I'm going to keep the coloring pretty simple. I am fully aware that this is supposed to be Bigfoot, and Bigfoot I think is like brown. I believe he's supposed to be anyway. But in order to match my pattern papers, I'm going to be using some YG 90 markers because you can color your cards any way you want. But I'm going to go right in with my darkest color. I don't typically do this, but I know for a fact that these colors blend really nicely together, so I don't feel the need to oversaturate the paper. I'm not really doing any kind of crazy coloring here. I'm just adding a shadow underneath where his arms would be casting a shadow on his body, on either side of his body. So I'm just keeping a center light source. And you can see that I'm kind of using some squiggly lines. And that's just to kind of keep along with the texture within all of his furry areas. Blended that out with the YG 97, YG 95, and then I'm finishing off with the YG 91. Now for his face, his little hands, and his feet, I switched over to 2 YG markers, the YG 41 and the YG 45, I believe it is. And I didn't like it. It just didn't go. It was a little bit too bright. So in order to tone that down, being I already have the shading with these 2 colors, I'm going to take that YG 95 that we used for the rest of his body, and I'm just going to go directly over what I've already colored. And it will still be different from the rest of his body, like all those furry areas, but it will match a little bit better. So I believe they call this Copic glazing. I'm not too good with technical terms. I just do what I do. So I liked that much better. I just took a red marker to color in the little heart as well as his flower. And then I'm taking the stitched polygon, I believe these are called, dies by Honeybee Stamps. And I'm going to take one for this little guy. I'm going to cut him out. I'm going to stick him down with some Post-it note tape to make sure it doesn't shift around. I am going to use the next size larger in that same die set to cut out this pattern paper. And then I took a large stitched rectangle die to cut out my other pattern paper. Had I had a plan in my mind, I probably could have got all these done with one swoop of my Gemini, but I didn't. I very rarely have a plan for my cards. So next we're going to assemble everything together. I am cutting down a piece of this green cardstock that comes in the kit, just a little bit larger than that stitched rectangle die. That way it will leave a little bit of a border. I didn't measure correctly the first time, so I did have to snip a little bit more of that off. Going to adhere this large stitched rectangle onto this green green cardstock, not pattern paper, just to leave a little bit of a border, and then adhere that down to my white card base. By giving a little bit of a border to the pattern paper, it just makes it pop off the page a little bit more. And I don't know, for me, I just like to mat it onto something solid. It gives me more of a seamless transition, I guess. I'm not good with the pattern paper, guys. I'm trying. I adhered the larger polygon down flat onto my card, and for my sentiment, I treated another piece of that green cardstock with my anti-static tool, stamped out my sentiment with Versamark ink, sprinkled on some white embossing powder and went ahead and heat set that. Then trim this down into a sentiment strip that is just a little bit wider than the sentiment itself. I do use a microfiber towel just to dust off that residue that we get from that anti-static tool. Went ahead and popped up my main image here and then laid my sentiment right across there. I did have to add just a little bit of foam tape on either side of the sentiment strip and a little bit of adhesive right down onto that polygon with my image on it. That way it will lay flat across the entire card. I finished off with just a little tiny bit of sparkle with the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to the heart and the flower, and that is it for card number 1. Moving on to card number 2, I'm going to also use collection number 2, and first we will take a quick look at what comes in that collection. Of course, we have the envelope and the stamp set, and this is little lemons and a little flower there. We have some baker's twine, some enamel dots, and of course the double-sided 6x6 pattern papers. So for this one, I'm going to start by stamping out the lemon onto a piece of masking paper, and I fussy cut just one side of it because that's all I really need to mask off. And then I'm going to stamp it down onto some Neenah Solar White, mask that off, and then stamp it once again so it looks like there's 2 lemons that are kind of bushed together. Went ahead and removed the masking paper and we'll move on to the coloring. I'm keeping the coloring for this entire video pretty simple. I am starting off with the Y11, which is my lightest color, just to saturate the paper. Then I'm going to bring in the E99, which is obviously an E marker. It's a neutral tone. But because I don't want these to be overly bright, I want it to be a little bit toned down, more of a golden yellow. By using an E marker for your shading, you'll really be able to achieve that. Blended that out with the Y26, the Y23, and then went back in with that Y11. And this will kind of brighten it up, but also blend it out a little bit. And it wasn't working well and then I realized once I started with the next lemon that it was because the marker was pretty dry. So I switched over to a Y04, which is very similar to the Y11. And I just did the same thing for this second lemon here. But the only difference here is that I created a shadow where that other lemon is over, like kind of hanging over this one, and also created a shadow where that one leaf would also be hanging over this particular lemon, but otherwise colored them the same exact way. Now for the leaves, I brought back out my YG90 markers because they're still sitting on my desk from the first card, so why not use them again? But once again, I'm going to go right in with that darkest color first because they blend well together. For this first leaf here, it's kind of off on its side and bowed down, bent. We'll just say bent. So I'm going to add a little bit of shading to the base of the leaf as well as the tip of the leaf and concentrate a little bit of the darkest color towards the back. Now for these next 2 leaves, these are exactly the same, and they have a fold in the leaf itself. So it's folded over on itself. So where it's folded over on itself will cast a shadow. And again, I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the base of the leaf as well as the tip of the leaf. But I'm using the same color combination for all of them. Now I did go out of the lines a little bit. It didn't bleed. The marker didn't bleed or anything. It was totally my fault. I went right out of the lines. So before I fussy cut this out, and because it's such a dark color and I don't want to use my colorless blender, I'm just going to take my white gel pen to fix up that coloring mistake, and nobody will ever know the difference. Once that's done, I fussy cut this now one single image out, just leaving a small white border around the image itself. Now for the background of, or I guess the pattern paper that I'm going to be using, I'm going to be using these 2 here, and this larger one that I'm kind of arranging everything on will be the main panel. And the other one will just be a little strip off to the side to kind of break up the background a little bit. So I trimmed this panel down to a regular A2 size. So it's a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And for this one, I believe I cut 1 1/4 inches. I started off with 1 inch and it wasn't quite big enough. So I ended up cutting another strip for 1 inch at 1.25 inches. I'm having a hard time speaking today, guys. So next we will assemble or stamp out the sentiment and then assemble the card. But we're going to kind of put it together so I know exactly where to stamp the sentiment. So this strip is going to go off to the left-hand side. My lemons are going to go to the right, and my sentiment is going to be stamped directly onto that pattern paper underneath the lemons. Went ahead and adhered this main panel down to my card base, and I ended up popping up this strip just to add a little bit extra dimension to it so it wasn't so plain. So I took some foam tape and just lined that up and adhered that down to the left-hand side. Before adhering my lemons, though, so that I have room to stamp out my sentiment, I went ahead and stamped that out with some Hero Arts dye ink. Keep in mind that this pattern paper is a little bit, it's not really glossy, but it has, it's more slick than regular cardstock. So it may take a minute or two for your ink to dry, regardless of what type of ink you're using. Once that was stamped out, I adhered my lemons and added a few of the enamel dots, and that is it for this one. Oh, and a little bit of shimmer to the lemons. We can't forget the shimmer. So on to the third card. This collection is collection number 3, and you will notice a specific name on this stamp set. And this particular stamp set in this collection, I helped design for this kit. So we have some rainbows and clouds and a sun and a couple of sentiments. We also have 2 pieces of ribbon, as well as the enamel dots and, of course, the double-sided pattern paper. So for this one, I went ahead and used that masking paper again. So I stamped 2 of the larger clouds as well as the rainbow itself and fussy cut those out. I'm going to bring out my Misty or my mini Misty here, and I'm going to stamp out my images onto a piece of Nina Solar White. So I'm going to use the mask of the rainbow first, just for placement of the clouds, because I want the clouds to be in front of the rainbow. So I stamped out my first cloud and then masked that out. And then I'm going to take back out that mask for the rainbow, lined that up so that I could line the cloud stamp again, if that makes sense, just so that both clouds are kind of evenly spaced and in front of the rainbow. Stamp that second cloud out and mask that once again, and then I can line up the rainbow stamp right directly over those clouds, being they are already masked. Stamped the rainbow out and then used the masking paper to mask out the rainbow, because I'm going to do just a little bit of ink blending in the background, not a ton, but just to add a little bit of color. So I'm going to bring out my tumbled glass distress oxide as well as a blending brush, and these are the Blending Buddy brushes by Trinity Stamps, and I'm just going to add a tiny bit of color. I mean a tiny bit of color. I'm using a scrap piece of paper to kind of get rid of some of the ink on the brush, and I'm starting directly on the mask and kind of working my way out and kind of fading to white. So it's just barely there. Once that's done, I can remove my masks and move on to the coloring. Now I'm going to be using colors that match that pattern paper. You can see that I have that off to the side just so that I can use that as my guide as I pick out my colors. So I'm going to use 3 color blends for each one of the stripes, I guess you could call them, of the rainbow, and the darkest area is going to be closest to the clouds, and then I can blend that out with my mid-tone color a little bit and then finish off with the highlight color right on the top portion of that arch. That's what it's called, an arch of the rainbow. And I started with my darkest color each and every time because the colors that I'm using, especially this pink, especially the RV combination, tend to bleed a little bit. And I didn't want to take that chance, especially being these are right next to each other naturally. And I do have a little bit of that ink blending in the background. Usually, if it's a regular distress ink or a dye ink, you wouldn't necessarily have too much of a problem using a colorless blender directly over it. Distress oxides, I find that you are not able to do that. You are able to do it, but you're not going to get great results. It's going to turn into a weird consistency, the distress oxide itself, and it's not pretty. So I was just super careful, and part of that is by starting off with that darkest color. So moving on to the yellows, this time I'm actually using a YR marker for my shading. If you remember the lemon card, I used an E marker. This, I want it to be really nice and bright, so I'm using a YR marker for my contrasting color. Moving on to the greens, I'm just going to use a YG combination. And obviously, as you move down the rainbow, these little arches become smaller and smaller. So you're not necessarily going to bring up your darkest color very far once you kind of reach the bottom portion of the rainbow. I ended up using a BG combination instead of a B combination just because I felt like that matched the pattern paper a little bit better than a regular blue. And I do find that worked out well. Now, on the one side of one of the pattern papers is a solid color, and that definitely is a BG, and I have that off to the side off camera, and that's what actually I was using as my guide. So I'm just going to finish up this last little arch of the rainbow using a purple combination, and I didn't want to leave these clouds completely white. You certainly can, but I wanted to add a little bit of texture to them. So I'm going to bring out my C3, my C1, and C00, and where it's kind of indented in, I'm just creating little C's with the C3. Then I'm going to extend those little C's with the C1 and then take the C00, which is one step above a colorless blender, and I'm going to go over the entire thing. Next, I'm going to go ahead and die cut this particular panel down with a inside out diagonal stitched rectangle die by MFT. This is the second to largest one, and I'm going to take the largest one and cut out that pattern paper. And this is where I changed my mind again. I change my mind a lot, especially when I don't have too much of a plan going into this. I was going to use these polka dots as my background. And as I started assembling the card, I changed my mind. And you'll see here in just a minute. So I'm going to take this bluish, kind of like a BG. I would say that this is about a BG 15. color cardstock that comes in the kit, and I cut one panel that's just a little bit larger than my largest panel and one that's just a tiny bit larger than my panel with the rainbow on it. Again, I like to mat things because not only does it really pop off the page, but you have a little bit more of a transition going from one pattern to another. Because like I said, I struggle with that. So I'm just going to kind of glue everything together, adhere this main panel onto that smaller piece of that blue. And here's where I changed my mind. I liked the back more. And I know that the pattern in the die is not going to be as noticeable, but the pattern is a lot more busy, so I really wasn't too concerned about it. So adhered everything down onto my white card base. You can see that I have just a teeny tiny bit of a white border showing, and this will also make it pop off the page a little bit more. Now for my sentiment, I am going to create a sentiment strip with that same blue paper. You can see that I have a little piece off to the side. I saved that for my sentiment. Not going to show you this whole process again, but I treated it with my anti-static tool, stamped with Versamark, white heat embossed, and cut that into a skinny strip to adhere to the bottom portion of my card panel. I finished off with a little bit of shimmer, or a lot of shimmer actually, to the rainbow itself, and then added some crystal glaze by Nuvo, which is very similar to Glossy Accents. It's just a little bit thinner, but it looks a little bit cloudy now, but once it dries, it becomes clear and very shiny and adds just a little bit more dimension. Now you want to give this about, I would say, at least an hour or two to dry. I let mine sit overnight, but that is it for that one. So moving on to the fourth card, which I kind of feel like I cheated on, but you'll see there in a minute. First, we're going to take a look at what comes in this collection. Of course, you can see that we have a ton of ephemera here. We have the cute little stamp set, which I didn't actually end up using. I used ephemera, which is totally opposite of what I normally do, but I couldn't resist it. We have some twine here, and we have enamel accents or enamel dots, and of course the double-sided pattern paper. So I decided that I loved this ephemera so much, and it was mainly because of the centers of the flowers. The centers of the flowers have the dots like the ladybugs, and I thought that that was adorable, and I couldn't resist. So I cut the polka dot paper to an A2 size card and this other piece of pattern paper just a little bit smaller so those polka dots are showing through. And I'm just going to kind of arrange the ephemera the way I want it. I'm going to even use the sentiment from the ephemera. Not even stamping here, guys. So once I was happy with the placement, I can start permanently adhering everything together. So I adhered this smaller piece of pattern paper onto the larger and then adhered my sentiment down flat. Now I want my flowers to be popped up, but I want my little leaves to be under my flowers. So I arranged my flowers and leaves and kind of just picked up the corner a little bit to the leaves, put just a dot of glue there to make sure that they stay in place. That way my placement for my flowers and my leaves are going to remain the same even when I have to remove them. I added a little bit more adhesive just because I don't trust that one little dot and then added some foam tape to the back of the flowers and popped those up. Now here's where I feel like I cheated because this was way too easy. It came together in like 3 minutes. So I had to add a little bit of something, and the only really little bit of something is more of that crystal glaze because I've been obsessed with that lately too. So I added a little bit to the centers of the flowers, and that's it. That's it for card number 4. For the 5th and final card for today, I am going to be using the stencil that comes in the banana split level kit. And you can see that this has 2 parts to it. It has the raindrops on the top and the clouds on the bottom. And you can either use that as a mask or the stencil itself. You can either use the top portion of the clouds or the bottom, whatever you choose. I am going to use the raindrops. So I'm bringing back out the tumbled glass because, again, it's sitting on my desk. And I know that I had asked you guys what you want to see in kit videos, and you, most of you anyway, said that you'd like for me to stick to the kit and bring in very few things, and that is what I'm trying to do. So I covered up my entire panel with these raindrops, and they're really easy to line up if you're covering an entire panel. You just kind of slide it down, line them up, and continue on all the way down. I ended up cutting this down with that large stitched rectangle die that I used in a previous card, so it didn't have to be perfect to begin with. So I am going to mat this on black this time because I love matting things on black. I really feel like it makes it pop. I cut the black cardstock just a little bit larger than my card panel. And once again, I'm going to heat emboss my sentiment and cut that down into a strip. You can see that I already pre-colored my rainbow. I used the same colors as I did for the first one, but I didn't do any shading on this one. I kept it nice and simple. And then I am going to adhere everything together. Kept it really, really easy for this one, but I couldn't resist. I ended up adding more of that shimmer and more of that crystal glaze to this rainbow. I just couldn't help myself. But that's it. That's it for card number 5. Here's a quick look at all 5 cards that we created today. As always, I will leave the information for the kit as well as all of the supplies I used today in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by today and have a great day. Bye.